Hello, everyone. You're watching Mayshad Choice Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conversation. I'm Neza Alawi, founder and CEO of Mayshad Choice, the New York-based company that empowers women on a daily basis. I am here today with Jan Mercer-Dam, our VP of Development, and Dorcas. Hi, Jan.
Hi Neza, hi Dorcas, welcome everyone. So happy to see you on a Tuesday afternoon. It's bright and sunny here in New York. We hope it's sunny where you are too. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jan Mercer-Dam, the Vice President of U.S. Development with the Mayshad Group. We are an ecosystem of brands for women by women, championing women and connecting them to each other and to the causes, companies, organizations, and institutions that support and champion equity for women, professionally and personally. How do we do this, you ask? We do it through our live series where we bring together fabulous, accomplished women for conversations around money, diversity, equity, and inclusion, mental health during the time of COVID-19. We have Workshop Wednesdays, which we have an incredible workshop for you planned tomorrow related to all things related to your personal brand for how you appear online in the new digital world. So welcome everyone. Please remember to visit us at joinmayshad.com. That's joinmayshad, MAYSHAD.com. And we have a digital membership package just for you. So please make sure to pop in and take a look at that. We'd be thrilled to have you as a part of our ecosystem. Please also make sure to include all of your questions and thoughts for us during the course of the show, and we'll answer them. Thank you. Thank you, Neza. Thank you for hosting us. Excited to get started.
Yeah. Dorcas, we are so excited to have you today. So our guest today, Dorcas Lynn, is the president and founder of Diversity Health Communication and Strategic Advisor at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Her diversity and inclusion and corporate social responsibility experience spans leading global teams, talent acquisition and mobility, corporate branding, identity, campaigns, advocacy relations, and clinical trial recruitment and retention. Previously, Dorcas has served in various executive roles within health and hospital systems and at a top-tier healthcare and pharma public relations firms, including WCG and Ogilvy Public Relations Worldwide. Hello, Dorcas.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad we have sun today. It's been a little rainy lately.
It has been. So, Dorcas, my first question to you is a little bit related to the values that we care for at Mayshad. We talk a lot about the value of the personal narrative and in how we connect to each other at a human level. Could you share with us why in the work that you do, you believe that personal narratives are so critical to understanding health?
Absolutely. And I encourage individuals to actually dig deep into their personal stories, and because often people believe that they don't have a diversity narrative if they're not part of a unique group that is typically focused in the diversity space. And in fact, everyone has a diversity narrative in terms of what their unique talents and contributions are that they can bring. My focus in what I do has stemmed from an incident during my adolescence. When I was 15, I learned that my maternal grandmother had been part of the U.S. public health trials that took place in Puerto Rico. And at that time in the 1940s, she, after giving birth to my mother and my uncle, my mom's twin brother, she woke up to discover that she had been sterilized without her consent. And luckily, she had already had established her family. But this was devastating news for her, that this ability to reproduce on her own terms and in her own family decision-making was taken from her. And as a teenager, hearing this story was devastating for me. I was full of rage and shock that this could happen to someone that I loved. And I was so fortunate to have a community of educators and family who helped channel that rage into what became my passion around using medicine as a tool for social justice. And so that has been the impetus and the seed, the fire that has influenced all of the educational, academic, and professional choices that I've made throughout my life. And so that narrative really bubbled up for me when I think about what we're facing today in terms of medicine and how it can be useful, but how it can also be used and weaponized against communities that are vulnerable. And so that is really where my story starts and where it continues.
Thank you, Dorcas. It's impressive to see how personal story does make us stronger in our vision to change the world. And I think that the biggest, like change makers are the ones that are reacting to a personal story, which makes them like better, like in their way to testify what is the feeling and where the needs can make. I'm looking for a word in English, which is anyway, forget it. But yes, to testify a little bit, it's we can get into a life mission and a career without knowing exactly what others are going through and how it is affecting them. But definitely, when we have a personal story that takes us there, we're much stronger.
I think that there's also, Neza, to your point as well, the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research, and from the healthcare perspective too, and understanding that, often as we think about, Dorcas, to your point, just around the history of how we think about the intersectionality of race, class, and gender as it pertains to everything from advocacy to access to healthcare to the ways in which things are tested and tried on different underserved and underrepresented populations. Isn't it that the personal narrative, in the sense of then how you do your work from a healthcare communications perspective, becomes much more rich and much more rewarding? And talk to us a bit about that.
It is rewarding. However, it's also quite frustrating because the legacy of abuses within medicine in particular, and vulnerable communities and communities of color really go much further back than my grandmother's experience in the 1940s. We know about the Tuskegee abuses. And so to be at a moment in time where one of the most impacted populations are in fact the very people who continue to have valid justification to mistrust the healthcare system is such an irony and such a perfect storm in terms of what we're seeing now, because we look at the numbers and we see that particularly here in the US, those populations, particularly Black and Brown people in communities all across the country, are being the greatest impacted in terms of morbidity with COVID-19. And they also are the ones who are having challenges in terms of getting the best access. I think poignantly about the recent story of the New York City, Brooklyn teacher who went to the ER 3 times and was turned away and told to go recover at home because her symptoms were not taken seriously. And she was told that she had everything else and she was not granted a test. So when you talk about access and how different communities are being treated by the healthcare system, you start to question whether or not we're just repeating the same patterns over and over again, just a different way of experiencing injustice.
When we think about the world now and the complexities of managing it on a daily basis, how have you been advised by your clients and colleagues about how we can be better leaders in how we think about inclusion going forward, support moms and parents, support the uniqueness of the individual, ensure that companies are being advocates for mental health components?
So those are a lot of topics in one. And one thing that I think is also very important is this moment in time has also shown us how much ageism exists in our society. We have actually heard leaders talk about the acceptability of losing the life of senior members of our society as a sacrifice for the greater good. And so when we think about the ageism piece, that's an overlay of what we're experiencing in terms of just the inequities. I wanted to just add that piece from Dan's earlier question. But in terms of how we're supporting moms and how we're supporting this new workplace reality, inclusion is something that we were struggling with while we were sitting in rooms together in the workplace. And so being removed several steps from being able to see verbal cues or silent cues that we may not get through the virtual landscape are going to be critical for us to pay attention to in terms of how we engage our introvert colleagues, how we engage our global colleagues who have cultural differences in how they communicate and how they show up for a discussion, how they share their ideas in a large group. And so all of those efforts that we were trying to improve when we were together, we now have to double down and do an even more effective job of paying attention to those opportunities where we can ask more questions, not make assumptions, and not take everyone's situation for granted that we're all experiencing the same thing, because we're not. People have referenced that we're in this together. But I like the analogy that has become very popular now, which is we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. I am very aware of my privilege that I can work from home, that I can have the opportunity to have resources to help my children learn remotely. Not everyone has that ability. And so this notion that we're all in the same boat is really insensitive to the realities of many, many individuals and communities.
And we need to remember that some don't even have a meal for their children at home. And those children were going to school to have a meal. And it is very hard in those times to feel that we cannot provide our family with that dignity level of safety, not even comfort. Dorcas, from an external point of view and in the lens of diversity and inclusion, we would think that the healthcare world is, with the humanity that it's facing, the humanity's problems that it's facing all the time, that we would imagine that the diversity and inclusion is a topic that is more inclusive than in other industries. Is this a reality or not?
So one of the projects that I have spent some time looking about and thinking about is the challenge of racism in medicine and racism in healthcare, and how it has impacted patients on the one hand, but also how it is experienced by the people who work within health and hospital systems. So I've been doing some assessment of policies around how organizations deal with the racist patient, for example. And so not only are there issues of challenges of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that healthcare professionals have towards certain populations, but it's also what happens when you have a patient who comes in and actually creates an extreme hostile environment because of requests for a specific race in terms of who gives them their care. And so we have to be very cautious about putting policies in place that allow healthcare workers to have dignity when those instances occur and have the support of their institution so that the values of equity and ethics are loud and clear, and patients understand that there's a line that can be drawn when you go from requests of concordance. For example, when a Muslim female patient requests a female physician, which most health and hospital systems will accommodate, versus a language preference that allows the individual to have a better understanding of their diagnosis and of their treatment and prognosis plan. But when you then look at the slippery slope of requests that are based on race concordance, you start to get into that very gray ethical area, and you want to make sure that teams within the hospital system are prepared to manage that kind of situation. And since the 2016 election occurred, there has been, the American Hospital Association has actually been able to show traction in the increase of those types of requests since 2016. And so it is happening across the country at various institutions, and we haven't been prepared to manage that in a unified way. So we need policies around that.
Dorcas, thank you. Thank you for that. I think it's interesting as we think about this moment in time and what COVID-19 has done from just the public perception of the way in which we have now seen the value of essential workers, for example, and keeping the economy together. And those of us who risk our lives every single day helping to treat people who are ill. And is it in this moment in time that we're seeing that more clearly because it's more apparent, right, in the news? And in New York City, everyone opens up their windows at 7 p.m. and cheers on, the people that serve in essential frontline responsibilities, whether those front lines are grocery stores or businesses that are deemed to be essential, or the people that are handing us our takeout, or people that are caring for our sick loved ones. And do you think that there's a moment in time, an opportunity right now, where those of us, to your point earlier around being fortunate and privileged enough to work from home, will start to have a deeper level of appreciation for those that are in frontline positions, which is often muddled by race and class and gender as well? And is this a moment in time to think through those bridges, and what do we do from here?
Well, I think I've been very vocal about being very appreciative and touched and moved by all of the commercials and advertisements and social media that celebrate our essential workers and thank them. But the true acknowledgement and thank you of their work is pay equity, is access to healthcare, access to insurance, access to safe workplace environments. All of those issues are how we say thank you. And until we're able to see that change from a policy perspective, I think that the messages are somewhat shallow. And so I've been very sensitive to the contradictions that we see, because on the one hand, we have so much media that is congratulatory, but on the other hand, we see so much xenophobia in the jokes that are made about not going to Chinese restaurants, for example. How is that impacting Asian communities in terms of those very toxic jokes that actually exacerbate the stereotypes? And what does that do to, for example, many of our cities have populations of Filipino American nurses who are Asian women for the most part, and how are those types of attitudes impacting their ability to be on the front line serving patients when there's such a backlash. So I see it twofold. I see that some tremendous attention has been given to essential workers as where we need to place our value and our appreciation, but on the other hand, there's been a huge backlash as well. And I just want to make a plug. For the first time, I have acknowledged to every single IT help desk person in America that they are the front line, because if it weren't for them, we would not function. When everyone had to ramp up to Teams and Skype and have all of their devices and the devices of their children, if they are parents trying to navigate this new norm, IT are essential workers as well. And I have no IT members of my family, but I just really, they have saved my life.
It's so true. I think we can all give a big shout out to every single IT person who's helped us tremendously in the last couple of months. I'm wondering, just a quick follow-up to this as well, as I think it's really interesting. I think you're spot on. And I'm wondering if this is also an opportunity for companies to become much more awake in the sense of how they listen to employees, particularly for companies that employ different types of workers, and those that are on the front line versus those that work in the administrative or corporate headquarters offices or whatever the case may be. Is this also a moment in time for employers to think more outside the box in the sense of how do they ensure the safety and health and well-being from a perspective of inclusion from a corporate culture perspective, but then ensuring that they're really listening and thinking through what is the new normal in the sense of even compensations and fringe benefits that they provide to employees.
Absolutely. One of the things that has been very prevalent across industry, this is industry agnostic as far as I'm able to see, not just in healthcare, but organizations really taking the time to hear what on the ground challenges are. What does it mean for individuals to have to break shelter in place rules so that they can get to work? How are organizations equipping them with work letters of support? How are they understanding the timing issues around working parents who are educating and working and managing a household all at the same time? Women in particular have been known to have double duty. If they're professional women and then going home and managing a family, well, now it's triple duty because you're doing all three. And it's a 24-hour cycle and it never ends. So what does that mean for working parents and working moms in particular? So being able to tap into organizations that have employee resource groups and using them as real assets in that qualitative assessment of what is real and what the needs are so that they can be responsive to their employee communities, I think is essential in terms of moving forward. Particularly for those organizations, I mean, Google, put their flag in the ground. They're remote for the rest of the year. Who's going to follow their footsteps, and what does that mean? Because that's not just a couple of weeks. That really is an extended amount of time. And if we're looking at productivity and the ability for people to show up in remote and virtual work environments, we need to take those needs into account.
Dorcas, can you tell us about some initiatives that you tried to personally implement and that has failed because of the resistance to change of a larger corporate culture?
Yes, this is not specific to COVID-19, but I have had the experience of working with clients who, while aspirationally they believed they were ready to take on DE&I initiatives and make a commitment, the actual work was something that they were not comfortable or able or ready to take on. So for example, I had an experience with a client who very much wanted to show and experience a significant change in the number of people of color in leadership roles within administrative departments. Very specific goal, attainable if you put a strategy in place. But when the strategy focused on truly mentoring and sponsoring and providing programmatic work to focus on those high potential women, they got very uncomfortable and were not ready or in a position to make the commitment. And when that happens, it really is several steps backwards, because what it tells the employee community is that it's for face value, it's for reputation, but not truly to impact change within the organization. And that can harm the organization in terms of its competitive advantage, because that seeps out reputationally. People talk about their organizations and what they do or don't do in external channels. And so that really hurts an organization's potential to be competitive. And so I have been frustrated in that, I've worked very creatively to put together those programs and be ready to initiate and implement them. And then the wheels have slowed to a halt.
It's interesting what you're saying, because as you said, people, sometimes have a clear vision on, but they want a fast solution and they want it to cost nothing. Okay, find them, put them there, and what you're saying is totally legitimate. I mean, it needs to go through the empowerment, the training, the preparation of a batch of women of color to be able to put them there. And yes, that's also the sad part of, the biggest, the largest of the corporate world is, it's so much driven by economic choices that sometimes making that change of culture can be very hard. So do you think that now, with what is happening with the COVID-19 situation, there will be changes, inevitable changes that will happen?
In terms of how DE&I programs are implemented within the workplace, what I think is going to be critical is how organizations define inclusion. Because what we want to make sure is that many organizations think that they've gotten the mark when they have representation. But representation means nothing in the diversity space unless we have inclusion that allows for people to show up with their differences, and that we can celebrate, respect, and appreciate those differences so that it adds value to innovation, right? If we're all the same, we know from all of the studies, we know from the Harvard Business Review articles across the categories within DE&I, all of the literature suggests, all of the McKinsey literature suggests that when you put high performance folks who are all the same together, the innovation actually slows, as opposed to high performers who are diverse on multiple dimensions, who can actually lead more quickly and more creatively to solutions that actually matter for patients, for customers, for your stakeholders. So I do think that the resources are limited within the crisis that is occurring. And so all of the focus has to be on how do we support employees, how do we support the employee resource groups in doing the work that's necessary to keep people cohesive. But once the crisis is over, we really need to look at what does inclusion mean in a virtual reality, and how do we, as we spoke earlier, how do we make sure that we pay closer attention to some of those nonverbal cues that allow us to understand how are we making decisions about who talks in those meetings, how are we making decisions about who gets the special project, if we're not able to have the lunch or have the hallway conversation. How do we do that in a virtual space that is equitable?
So it's almost like FOMO on a whole different level. Right. And as companies go back to work, some will be going back to an office while some will maintain more of a remote work schedule, and ensuring that inclusion also includes opportunities for people to feel engaged, no matter if they're struggling in the workplace because of fear and anxiety of being in the physical workspace. And for those that are remaining home, like how do you really include those others that are left at home in the most productive way as well?
And there's some very serious decisions that have to be made in terms of the companies that decide to enter this new realm of virtual work, or those who very quickly rush back to trying to create what existed before. And those organizations that hold on to the past in that way will not win the race in terms of talent. And that's going to be critical for the diversity of employees and minds and creative minds that they can bring to the table.
Let's talk a bit about something that's been on the minds of many of us lately, is around the concept of vaccines and how that will come to market. And from your perspective, from a public health perspective and a social justice perspective, what should we know about that whole process as it pertains to the development of drugs, the testing, the clinical trials, and from the perspective of the quality of care and the ethics surrounding this moment in time, in particular for how we all potentially could receive a vaccine in the future?
So one of the critical issues of equity in clinical trials for COVID-19 is, in fact, who participates in those trials. When we look at vaccine development, we know not just in vaccines, across the board in every therapeutic area, historically, early compounds have been tested globally in third world communities, where the individuals, the patient volunteers who participate in those trials actually rarely will have an opportunity to partake in benefiting from those drugs when they ultimately come to market. So access to medicines is a huge issue. And with vaccines, we know that there's already been quite a bit of information around testing in specifically African communities and populations, where there is very little on the ground support for safety and efficacy for those individuals in terms of their experience in participating in research. So it really is going to be on the shoulders of pharmaceutical companies and partnering with global health organizations to maintain a very high level of ethics in terms of how they engage participants, how they ensure dignity in the informed consent, as well as working with local governments to ensure that they will ultimately have access when these vaccines become available. And so much of my work prior to focusing primarily on DE&I was in the area of clinical trial recruitment globally, and looking at issues of patient access when trials are done within vulnerable populations. And it's really, I think there will be a critical eye on how big pharma collaborates and brings an ethical approach to how they do this work. And sometimes, unfortunately, speed requires us to make hard choices about how we do the work. And so that's going to be critical in terms of making sure that we don't go so fast that we actually drop some of our standards for how we treat human beings who participate in trials.
Thank you. Thank you, Dorcas. Should we go to questions, Neza, from our audience?
Oh, sorry. Sure, Jan. So this question from our audience is, what does mean today in the healthcare system? What is, I guess by that it's, what is the achievement or the goal in having an equitable healthcare environment?
I'm sorry, if I understand the question, you're asking what is the goal of DE&I within healthcare?
Yeah, what would be, yes, the final goal for it?
So in general, when we look at population health and we look at the stark reality of morbidity and mortality in different populations across the country, we know that Hispanics, African Americans, Native Americans, all have significant rates that are not in proportion to their prevalence in the population. So when we look at DE&I from a healthcare perspective, we're looking at what institutional and societal issues do we have to address so that we're looking at prevention of many of these diseases, such as diabetes and hypertension and maternal mortality and morbidity. And how do we do population health work so that we're addressing those public health issues? But then when those individuals enter the healthcare system, how do we make sure that they have the information, the education, the cultural competency, and the health literacy to be able to hear a diagnosis, understand it, and act upon it in ways that will allow them to gain health again? And so it really is about making the field more equitable as far as access and outcomes.
Access and outcomes. Thank you.
We talk a lot about the intent, but I think we've been talking about intent far too long, at least in my lifetime. I thought that the intent was all about what I studied in school. And once I got out into the world, I was going to find impact. And we're still talking about intent in organizations all over the world. And I'm really trying to figure out with colleagues and clients, and even in my, my social gatherings, how do we get from in good intent to actual positive outcomes that really make a difference? And it's that bridge that I think we're all struggling to figure out what is the magic formula for that. And I don't think anyone has quite figured it out. People have done it in pockets, but there's no formula across the board that anyone in any industry has figured out.
Thank you, Dorcas. I have another question here. What role does public health infrastructure play in the COVID-19 response?
So I think this question is fundamental to the entire society in terms of how much it has exposed our lack of investment in infrastructure. The whole purpose of public health is to be able to use data to assess where there are hotspots, who needs the best intervention, the fastest intervention, so that we can guarantee the greater good for society. And unfortunately, we are now, from a global perspective, an example of all of the things not to do from a public health perspective to be able to safeguard our communities. But there are clear guidelines that I believe many of our health officials are trying to push forth that really map out what it will take from a public health perspective, the steps in terms of testing and really being cautious about a staggered opening and being cautious about how we trace The forensic epidemiology is really fascinating in terms of all of the steps that go into how you assess that. And when we are, as a society and from a policy perspective, willing to acknowledge the critical resources needed and commitment to do that, public health will be effective. But when it is not funded, and when we have conspiracy theories that say COVID is not real, the public health system is greatly attacked.
Thank you, Dorcas. This question is, why does it seem there is a lack of strong minoritized and marginalized voices in public health leadership?
Well, it depends on public health leadership at what level. So if you look at, for example, there are many public health leaders who are also physicians, who are women of color in New York City at the national level, and they are working on the front lines to make sure that some of these public health measures are being implemented. The answer I have to that is this is a tremendous call to action for people to realize that getting public health education and working in public health is desperately needed in terms of representation from the communities that we're talking about. So I highly encourage individuals to take this opportunity to consider getting more advanced degrees in public health so that they can be part of the solution.
Are there unique equity consideration for those who are differently able?
Well, in the differently abled community, I think that there is such a great opportunity now for them to say, I told you so, in terms of already working through some of those very challenging issues of accessibility, remote access, how you contribute and how you are acknowledged for your work if you are working in a different environment than your colleagues. But I do think that this helps towards inclusion of differently abled populations in work teams and across departments within different industries, because it shows that productivity actually, in many instances, goes up when you are working in a virtual environment, and it actually takes away some of the stigma of individuals who have had to work remotely because of a specific need to not be able to come into a workplace environment.
Thank you, Dorcas. Our audience is very excited today. So this question, of course, had to be related to women. So what are the equity considerations for women?
Well, specifically in COVID-19, I think it's addressed, we addressed it earlier in terms of that triple role now that working moms are facing. But also, let's put moms aside for a moment, because one of the stereotypes we see with women in the workplace is, and this has to do with millennials and youth as well in the workplace, there is bias against how we overload women who are not mothers. And there's quite a bit of that bias going on in the workplace as well. So we don't want to punish women for being moms, and we don't want to punish them for not being moms. In other words, overburdening them, because we have the ability to make excuses like, well, you're not homeschooling any children running around, so you have more time to be more dedicated or to be more focused. And we don't want to fall into that slippery slope, because that brings us into a whole other level of pitting working women against one another. We really need to be allies amongst ourselves, as well as with men who are often the ones who are making decisions about who gets the special project or who gets to be on a particular team. So I think we have to be thoughtful about how we support one another in whatever our personal story is of what we're bringing to the table. I remember one instance in my career where I was challenged by employees around why do we need to care about working parents? They made the choice to be parents. They need to figure that out on their own. When in fact, the whole notion of flexibility is it doesn't have to be working parents. You could be taking care of seniors. You could be in a graduate program. You could have, 20 other special, important, valid reasons that make you a fulfilled individual and is part of your identity and part of what makes you authentic. And those are equally valid as being a parent. It's not that we're trying to say parents should get extra privileges, that working moms should get extra privileges. The diversity and inclusion of that is everyone has unique commitments and interests that make them whole. And we need to value that from a flexibility perspective that is inclusive of parents, so that we really are talking about allowing people to show up whole.
That's such an interesting and important point around the complexities of identity and how we think about the multitude of roles that we fulfill every single day of our lives, and how the needs of those and the wants and the desires of those can ebb and flow given the circumstance under which we're all living our lives professionally and personally right now, particularly right now in this moment in time of COVID. And I love what you said, Dorcas, around the fact that, no matter at what stage our children may be, if we have children, if we don't have children, but we're all nurturing and caretaking and giving in some shape or form. And I think for women right now, we're doing even more of that, right, in our communities and our networks, and just figuring out how to support each other and learning ourselves how to ask for help in very different, unique ways. The next question we have from the audience pertains to the incorporation of Eastern modalities into the healthcare setting. And do you find now in the work that you're doing with your clients, are there avenues now where there's more tolerance and more openness for Eastern modalities as it pertains to access, advocacy, and just the ethics around patient healthcare? And do you see that the bridge between those two worlds expanding a bit more now?
So I would say before this crisis, there was tremendous momentum in terms of workplace balance, mindfulness as an approach and a lens to approach one's work. And now there's been a tenfold turn to meditation, to mental health, to self-care in a way that I have never seen it before in the workplace, and seeing men speak about it, which is very different from who the voices were prior to the corona crisis, in terms of who were champions for that. But now you actually are seeing CEOs, male CEOs, talk about why it's so important for their employees to manage their own self-care, manage anxiety, figure out ways to talk about being simultaneously productive and anxious and fearful all at the same time during these unprecedented times. So I think that there is a focus on being able to use other forms of support that may not have been part of the status quo prior. It might have been considered, icing on the cake or a little bit out there in terms of being different or new wavy. And now it's almost become essential in terms of how we talk about what is happening in work life across the board.
That's very interesting. And this question is actually a really good follow-up to that as well. Will there be more social responsibility? If there's going to be more social responsibility, will there also be more openness to more organic or progressive forms of medicine versus the traditional pharmaceutical industry?
So one of the things that I have seen in my what I call Corona entertainment, which is me trying to figure out what types of informative education can I spend my time on where I'm not just completely watching all of my favorite Hulu and Netflix series. But there is an amazing, and his name is escaping me right now, but there's an amazing African-American man who lives in South LA, and he has a new masterclass that has come out about urban farming. And one of the things that I think our society has really opened their eyes to is the fact that our food is not guaranteed. And I think that this is across the board, not just for communities of color, but for all levels of class and social ranking. Unless you are, the super high 1% high echelon in terms of wealth and earners, the rest of us all had to go into markets to find empty shelves of everything critical. And so I think, especially for urban communities, this is an amazing time to engage youth in figuring out what it means to create and own our own food. And what does that mean? Attaching food to any environment, not just being in a rural farming environment. And if corporate social responsibility can actually bridge the gap of allowing more focus on how we eat better, how we maintain our immunity. We see in the data now that individuals with lower vitamin Ds are having more detrimental outcomes and more morbidity. But looking at all of the nutritional issues, and that really impacts communities of color and the wider population as well. That's a real opportunity for corporate social responsibility, I think.
Dorcas, it's really interesting what you're saying around urban farming and us having more control over our own food. And we've heard so much just recently come out around the infection rates in meatpacking plants. And so there's
immigrants who are working there.
Exactly. So there's the safety component, and of course the diversity component of the ways in which the factory workers don't have access to the protections that they need for themselves. There's the public food safety issue that we all should not be concerned about. There's the skepticism around that. But then also, what does it mean to live, life going forward in the sense of this food scarcity, and also knowing that we know that, one of the best things an individual can do to give back to the environment is to quit eating meat from a global climate change perspective as well. So would be interested to hear your thoughts on kind of the intersectionality of all of that together.
So there's some controversy around whether or not actually going to a complete vegetarian approach is actually healthy for the environment. I'm not someone who follows that literature very closely, but I am aware of some of the very dynamic debates that go on about that. But I do think that it makes us question how we approach being carnivores in this society, how we approach healthy, ethical forms of getting meat to our tables, getting vegetables to our tables, how it is cultivated from the farm to the store, and going back to how we look at essential workers. How is society viewing immigrant farmers who are laboring here and allowing us to pick up our strawberries and blueberries throughout all of this crisis, with no access to healthcare, with no access to securing their safety, just in terms of general basic life necessities while being here and doing this work that we all depend on so heavily. I think it makes us question all of those levels of what we eat, how we make the choices about where we get the food that we eat, and what will be best for our health and for the planet.
Thank you, Dorcas. Jan, we're getting at the end of this session. Dorcas, we thank you for joining us today. You have eased our stress about everything that is going on in the healthcare system, and thank you for contributing to creating more equity. It is important to create an equitable space for the patients that come to the hospitals, for the workers. I would like us to finish this session with also special cheers to all the health workers that are out there fighting for us, fighting for every COVID patient that is coming in now. Jan, Dorcas.
I just want to add appreciation for the healthcare workers, for teachers, and a plea for equitable pay for the value that they bring to society. I think we have seen from this who really keeps the world going that we probably took for granted in the past.
Absolutely, could not agree more. And that's what, we love having conversations like those with Mayshad, to be able to speak to our really diverse audience of female corporate executives, business owners, entrepreneurs, as we think about together, what do we do right now to help empower women and people that have been marginalized in different shapes and different ways. And what do we build together as we come out of COVID-19 and plan for the most innovative future as possible. Thank you, everyone. Make sure, please, to visit us at joinmayshad.com. Tomorrow's Workshop Wednesday. We invite all of you to participate in that. You'll learn how to create your personal brand in this moment in time of all things related to digital, including everything from lighting to background to how to present yourself and talk to a screen, which I know we're all getting used to, including myself. Please visit us and learn more about our membership at joinmayshad.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay with us for Thursday at 11 a.m. when we do our Women in Money series as well. Thank you, Neza. Thank you for hosting us again today.
And thank you both. It's been a delight to chat with you.
Thank you.